The words cracked like thunder in the chamber. Justice Samuel Alito, draped in the gravitas of his black robe, leaned forward and delivered the accusation with the weight of centuries behind him. "Congresswoman, you are disrespecting tradition." His voice carried not just over the room but across every screen tuned in, the kind of statement meant to wound, to shrink, to remind everyone watching who supposedly held the authority. For a moment, the silence that followed felt almost rehearsed, as though the nation itself had inhaled and then forgotten how to breathe. The phrase echoed, disrespecting tradition. It wasn't simply an accusation, it was a weapon. Alito spoke as though tradition was his personal kingdom, as though he alone decided who bowed to it and who desecrated it. His eyes narrowed, his tone dripping with condescension. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing the smirk tugging at the edge of his lips, a smirk that said he believed he had landed the blow that would define the exchange. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her hands remained still on the desk, her posture tall, her eyes steady. Viewers at home could see it, the flicker of fire, not in rash anger but in the deep, disciplined defiance of someone who had been underestimated her entire life. She did not look rattled. She looked ready. The chamber shifted. Onlookers darted glances, some leaning back, others leaning forward, sensing the tension was no longer a debate but a duel. Alito's words hung heavy, a relic of a past designed to silence voices like Crockett's, and yet across her face there spread the faintest trace of a knowing smile. It was the kind of smile that said, "You think you've cornered me, but you've already lost." On social feeds, the clip was already being cut, shared, and captioned. Outrage poured in real time. Tweets erupted. Did Alito really just say that? Posts filled with disbelief, anger, solidarity. Everyone knew a line had been crossed, but no one yet knew how Crockett would answer. The chamber felt as though it had tilted on its axis, the nation waiting in suspended animation for the counterstroke. But no one expected how Crockett would fire back, and what she said next would leave the room frozen in silence. To call it just a heated exchange would be to miss the entire point. What unfolded between Samuel Alito and Jasmine Crockett was not a momentary clash of personalities, but the collision of two Americas, one clinging desperately to the marble pillars of the past, the other insisting that justice must breathe, must evolve, must reflect the nation as it is today. When Alito accused Crockett of disrespecting tradition, it wasn't merely a personal slight. It was the full force of a judicial philosophy, a worldview rooted in the belief that old customs should forever dictate the possibilities of the present. For Alito, tradition has always been more than a principle. It has been a shield, a way to preserve hierarchy under the guise of reverence, a way to dismiss new voices by pretending that the past is sacred and untouchable. His words drip with that subtext: respect the way it has always been done or risk being branded a threat. But to millions watching, the so-called tradition he defended was not noble marble. It was chains, exclusions, doors slammed shut. And that is why this confrontation mattered so deeply. Jasmine Crockett was not merely being told to stay in her lane. She was being told in front of the nation that her very presence, her insistence on questioning old power, violated the sanctity of a system built without her in mind. To some, that moment looked like a scolding, but to others, it revealed something larger: the struggle over whether America's future will be defined by those who inherit power or by those who dare to challenge it. Crockett represented not only herself but every community that has been told to wait its turn, every voice dismissed as too loud, too brash, too untraditional. She embodied progress, the urgent demand that institutions reflect the diversity of the people they claim to serve. In that instant, she became a vessel for millions who saw in her composure, in her refusal to bow, a reflection of their own struggle for recognition. This wasn't about manners in a chamber. It was about whose values would define America in the decades to come. Alito sought to remind her, and by extension, the nation, that power comes from precedent, from the heavy tomes of history. But Crockett's calm defiance suggested something else: that true power comes from people, from the lived experience of those history tried to write out. Every camera angle, every paused breath carried more than drama. It carried stakes, stakes as old as the Republic itself. Would America continue to be chained to traditions that excluded so many, or would it finally honor the promise etched into its own founding words: equality, justice, representation? That was why the nation leaned in, not just to witness a sparring match, but to measure which America would emerge stronger from the clash. One America demanded silence, obedience, reverence. The other demanded dignity, inclusion, truth. And Jasmine Crockett's decision to answer Alito would not simply be her own defense. It would be an act of defiance against the weight of centuries. It would be the spark that turned a courtroom exchange into a cultural reckoning. And yet, to understand why Alito's words carried such weight, and why Crockett's reply shook him to the core, we must rewind the tape. Samuel Alito has long fashioned himself as the sentry of the old order, a man who sits high above the fray, cloaked in the weight of the Supreme Court's history, convinced that the rules of yesterday must dictate the rules of tomorrow. His rise from New Jersey prosecutor to one of the nation's most powerful jurists has been marked by one consistent theme: a devotion to tradition, invoked not as a living guide but as a weapon to halt change. In his eyes, tradition is not negotiable. It is sacred. And those who question it, to him they are trespassers. His career has been a slow tightening of that grip. As a federal appeals judge and later a Supreme Court justice, Alito carved a reputation for opinions that leaned heavily toward preserving institutional power. He cloaked his decisions in lofty language, citing precedent with a scholar's ease, but behind the citations was always the same philosophy: tradition protects order, and order must not bend to progress. Critics have long accused him of wielding tradition selectively. When precedent supported rights for marginalized groups, he suddenly found precedent less persuasive. When precedent restricted them, he wielded it like iron chains. That double standard did not go unnoticed. To many, it exposed not fidelity to law but allegiance to ideology. To his supporters, Alito was the stalwart guardian of American heritage. To his critics, he was the robed patriarch of a system built for the privileged few. Moments from his career illustrate the contrast. In decisions touching on reproductive rights, workers' protections, or voting access, Alito often sided with narrowing those rights, arguing that the Constitution did not guarantee them, that tradition did not recognize them. And yet, when questions of corporate influence or executive power arose, suddenly tradition bent in favor of the powerful. To those outside the court's marble walls, this looked less like consistency and more like hypocrisy. His demeanor, too, fed the archetype. Alito often appeared in hearings and public moments with a condescending patience, as though entertaining arguments he already deemed beneath him. Critics recall his infamous eye rolls, his barely concealed smirks during dissenting opinions, the tone of a man not simply disagreeing but dismissing. His defenders called it confidence. His detractors saw arrogance. The irony is that Alito, the self-proclaimed guardian of tradition, has become the embodiment of what many fear tradition can devolve into: a shield for exclusion. His version of tradition reveres marble halls but dismisses the voices that echo outside them. It speaks the language of dignity while overlooking the indignity imposed on those left out of the system. He insists that his fidelity is to the law, yet time and again, the law he elevates seems to enshrine privilege rather than expand justice. This is why his accusation against Jasmine Crockett carried such venom. It was not a spontaneous retort. It was the culmination of a career spent defining tradition as a fortress, with himself as its gatekeeper. In his eyes, Crockett was not just a congresswoman. She was an intruder, someone daring to question the sanctity of a system he had devoted his life to protecting. The smirk, the tone, the slow pronunciation of disrespecting tradition, all flowed from decades of positioning himself as the patriarch who decides who belongs and who does not. And yet, beneath the robe, Alito's humanity has not always matched his lofty ideals. Reports of his entanglements, his willingness to attend events hosted by partisan groups, and his choice to publicly signal political sympathies have drawn scrutiny. For a man who preaches impartiality, the cracks in his marble facade reveal partisanship and bias. That hypocrisy, preaching one thing, practicing another, has only deepened the frustration of those who see him less as a neutral judge and more as a political actor draped in judicial robes. The story of Samuel Alito, then, is not simply the biography of a judge. It is the blueprint of an antagonist. His arc traces the old guard's attempt to enshrine its worldview indefinitely. His words to Crockett were not the slip of a tongue. They were the crystallization of a lifetime spent equating tradition with power. In him, the audience can see the archetype of arrogance, a man who believes history belongs to him and that questioning his authority is an act of disrespect. But across the aisle, a very different story was unfolding, one born not in marble courtrooms, but in the grit of lived struggle. Long before she stood beneath the hot lights of the national stage, before her name trended across timelines and filled television chyrons, Jasmine Crockett was simply a young woman navigating a country that did not always make room for voices like hers. She knew what it meant to be dismissed. She knew what it felt like to fight uphill battles with little more than grit and conviction. And it was those very scars, those years of struggle, that became the armor she carried into every confrontation, including the one that pitted her against Justice Samuel Alito. Crockett's story begins far from the marble of Washington. She grew up in a household that lived the challenges millions of working families know too well: the long days, the careful budgeting, the constant reminder that dignity was something you fought for every single day. Education was never handed to her. It was wrestled from a system that doubted her. She learned early that silence did not protect you, that when someone tried to push you aside, your only chance at survival was to stand taller. That resolve carried her to law school, a world where her presence was often seen as an anomaly rather than an inevitability. She didn't arrive with privilege in her back pocket. She arrived with the determination of someone who knew what it meant to be voiceless, and she had vowed to make sure fewer people experienced that same isolation. Her path wasn't smooth. There were professors who doubted her, peers who underestimated her, mentors who never came. But what she lacked in connections, she made up for in fire. Her decision to become a public defender was no accident. While many classmates sought lucrative careers in towering firms, Crockett stepped directly into the trenches. Day after day, she represented people society had cast aside: the poor, the accused, the forgotten. She didn't just fight cases, she fought for humanity. Every courtroom became a lesson in inequity, every client a reminder that justice in America, too, often depends on wealth and skin color. She stood beside those who had no one else, shouldering the weight of their stories, refusing to let the system crush them without a fight. These years shaped her into something formidable, not a politician rehearsing talking points, but a warrior fluent in the language of struggle. She learned how to confront authority that sneered at her, how to dismantle arguments built on intimidation, how to transform pain into purpose. By the time she entered politics, she carried the battlefield of the courtroom within her, the rhythm of cross-examinations, the instinct to pounce on hypocrisy, the unwavering belief that justice belongs to everyone. When she won her seat in Congress, Crockett did not trade in her fire for polish. She brought it with her. She spoke with the urgency of someone who had no interest in appeasing the comfortable. She confronted colleagues with boldness, refusing to sugarcoat the truth. To some, this made her controversial. To many, it made her essential. She became the voice for those who felt Congress rarely spoke their language: communities of color, working families, immigrants, and everyday people who knew too well how easily the word tradition could be twisted into exclusion. Unlike Alito, whose authority was built on robes and rituals, Crockett's authority was built on scars. Her strength came not from ceremony but from experience. She had been underestimated before. She had been told she was too much, too loud, too untraditional. and every time she answered not with retreat but with resilience. That is why, when she sat across from Alito, she did not shrink. She carried with her the echoes of every courtroom where she had stood against impossible odds, every neighborhood where she had listened to the stories no one else wanted to hear, every moment where she had chosen courage over comfort. Her very presence was a rebuttal to the accusation that she disrespected tradition. In truth, she embodied a new tradition, one that insisted on inclusion, on dignity, on justice for all. To her supporters, Crockett represents more than a politician. She represents possibility, the idea that leadership in America does not have to look like it always has, that power can wear a different face, speak with a different cadence, and still command the room. Her authenticity is her strength. She does not pretend to be flawless. She is transparent about her journey, her mistakes, her growth. And it is that openness that makes her connection with ordinary Americans unshakable. So when Samuel Alito leveled his accusation, believing he could rattle her with the weight of tradition, he misunderstood who he was dealing with. Crockett was not a guest in his world, begging for acceptance. She was a fighter forged in the crucible of injustice, standing in her own right, speaking for those who had long been silenced. So when Alito leveled his insult, he wasn't facing a timid newcomer. He was facing a woman forged in fire, and her reply would prove it. The air in the chamber was already heavy when Samuel Alito leaned forward again, his voice steady but sharpened with a patronizing edge. "Congresswoman," he said slowly, savoring each syllable as though they carried divine weight, "there are certain standards, certain traditions that have guided this country for generations. Your tone, your conduct, it does not honor them." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The dismissal was woven into the cadence, into the carefully chosen pauses that implied she was little more than an unruly guest in a house she did not belong to. A murmur swept across the audience. Some heads nodded in agreement, affirming the comfort of Alito's words. Others bristled, recognizing the insult beneath the polished veneer. To call someone undignified, to accuse them of dishonoring tradition, was to say, without saying, that they were unworthy. Crockett did not immediately respond. She let the silence stretch, her eyes fixed on him, her hands folded neatly before her. To the cameras it looked like composure. To Alito it looked like hesitation. And so, sensing advantage, he pressed harder. "Respect, Congresswoman, is not optional. It is earned through restraint, through deference to the wisdom of those who came before. You might learn from that." The words stung for their audacity. The implication was unmistakable. Crockett was a novice, a disruptor, someone who needed to be tutored in how to behave. The chamber seemed to shrink as the tension mounted, each side of the aisle waiting to see if she would fold beneath the weight of his authority. But Crockett was not folding. She was calculating. Her gaze did not waver, her expression unflinching. Those who knew her best recognized the look, the steady, deliberate patience of a woman preparing her strike. Finally she spoke. "Justice Alito," she said, her tone even but edged with steel, "respect is not a one-way street. It is not demanded from the top down. It is earned by listening, by recognizing the people you claim to serve." The chamber stirred. Reporters scribbled, cameras inched closer. She had not raised her voice, but she had shifted the ground beneath his feet. Alito adjusted in his seat, lips pressed thin. "Tradition," he retorted, "is the foundation of this republic. Without it there is chaos." "Tradition," Crockett shot back, her words quicker now, sharper. "Without justice is not order, it's oppression dressed up in ceremony." Gasps rippled through the room. The duel was no longer hidden beneath civility, it was laid bare. Alito bristled, his face tightening as though unaccustomed to such direct challenge. The cameras caught every twitch, every narrowing of the eyes. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if to reclaim control. "You speak as though experience means nothing, as though the wisdom of generations is irrelevant. That, Congresswoman, is precisely what I mean when I say disrespect." And here Crockett smiled, subtle, deliberate, almost imperceptible but devastating. It was the smile of someone who knew the tide was turning. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his. Justice Alito, with all due respect, wisdom is not the same as entitlement. And tradition that silences the majority for the comfort of a few, is not wisdom at all. The chamber tightened like a drum. Every word now carried the weight of a blow, every sentence drawing the audience closer to the edge of their seats. Social media feeds lit up in real time, snippets of her sharp interjections already circulating. Alito, the unshakable patriarch, was suddenly on defense. The silence that followed was not empty, it was electric, charged with anticipation. The nation could feel it. Something was building, something larger than a disagreement. Crockett was no longer just defending herself. She was dismantling the very framework Alito tried to impose. And then, with a steady breath and unshakable gaze, Crockett unleashed the words that would flip the script entirely. The chamber was so still it seemed the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every camera zoomed in. Every pen hovered above a notebook, waiting. Alito leaned back, cloaked in the certainty that his authority would prevail. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett inhaled, slow and deliberate, as though summoning not just her own strength but the voices of generations behind her. She began softly, so softly that some in the gallery leaned forward to catch her words. "Justice Alito," she said, her tone respectful but edged with conviction, "you speak of tradition as if it were holy. But tell me, what exactly do you mean by tradition?" The question hung in the air. She didn't rush. She let the silence sting, let him fumble with the weight of having to define what he had invoked as untouchable. Before he could reply, she pressed on. "Because when I hear that word," Crockett continued, her voice gaining force, "I think of women denied the right to vote for 144 years. That was tradition. I think of African Americans counted as 3/5 of a human being. That was tradition. I think of children working in factories, of segregation at water fountains, of whole communities excluded from the promise of America. All of that was tradition." A gasp cut through the chamber. A few scattered claps echoed, quickly hushed. The weight of her words was undeniable. She paused, letting the audience feel the sting of history. Then she tilted her head, eyes fixed on Alito. "So I ask you again, what exactly are we defending when we defend tradition?" Alito shifted uncomfortably. His lips pressed together, searching for a retort, but none came fast enough. The silence was his answer, and Crockett seized it. "Tradition without justice is nothing more than yesterday's mistakes wrapped in a flag and called sacred," she declared. Her voice now carried the rhythm of a sermon, each phrase building on the last. "Tradition told Rosa Parks to stand up. Tradition told Thurgood Marshall he would never sit on the bench you now occupy. Tradition told my grandmother she wasn't welcome in the schools her taxes helped build." She leaned in, her voice steady. "And yet here I stand, a black woman, a congresswoman in this chamber, because progress demanded that we break with tradition." The audience erupted. This time the applause could not be hushed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Pundits' phones lit up as clips raced onto social media feeds. Alito tried to maintain his composure, but the camera caught the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, a flicker of unease. Crockett didn't let the moment slip. She pressed the advantage. "You tell me to show deference, but deference to what? To silence, to exclusion, to the comfort of those already in power." She let the question sting, her gaze sweeping the chamber. "No, Justice, I was not sent here to bow my head. I was sent here to raise my voice, because the people who elected me have lived under the shadow of your so-called traditions long enough." Her words landed like thunder. The gallery broke again into murmurs, a mixture of awe and shock. Alito's usual mask of detached superiority faltered. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened. For the first time he looked cornered. And Crockett wasn't finished. She lowered her tone, almost whispering, forcing everyone to lean closer. Respect is not submission. Respect is earned. And if the court or any man in this chamber believes it deserves automatic respect simply because of age, title, or tradition, then perhaps it has forgotten what America truly stands for. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the line, the one destined to ricochet across screens, to be clipped, replayed, and remembered. Crockett raised her chin, eyes locked on Alito. Tradition built the walls. Justice tears them down. And if you think my presence here disrespects tradition, then you have just proven why tradition must change. The chamber erupted. Applause thundered. Shouts of "That's right" echoed from the gallery. Even some who had sat stone-faced on the opposite aisle shifted uneasily, caught between the weight of Alito's faltering authority and the undeniable truth of Crockett's words. Alito opened his mouth, perhaps to retort, but no sound came. The cameras caught it all: the hesitation, the visible falter, the crack in the armor of a man who had built his legacy on being untouchable. Crockett simply sat back, hands folded, the faintest hint of a smile touching her lips. She had not shouted, she had not flailed. She had dismantled him with logic, history, and an unshakable moral clarity. Reporters in the press pool immediately typed out the phrase that was already trending online: "Tradition built the walls. Justice tears them down." Within minutes, it was everywhere, on Twitter, on Instagram, on TikTok, clips watched millions of times. But inside the chamber, all that mattered was the silence of a justice visibly rattled, and a congresswoman who had just claimed the high ground with a mic drop heard around the nation. And yet this was only the beginning. Because the shockwaves of that moment didn't stop in the room, they ripped across the country within hours. It began like a spark, then spread like wildfire. Within minutes of the exchange, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's words, "Tradition built the walls, justice tears them down," was ripped from the chamber feed and uploaded onto Twitter. By the end of the hour, the hashtag Crockett vs. Alito was trending at #1 in the United States and climbing globally. On TikTok, creators wasted no time. Edits appeared with slow-motion zooms on Alito's faltering expression, set to pulsing hip-hop beats. One viral clip paired Crockett's mic drop with Kendrick Lamar's "We Gon' Be All Right," racking up millions of views before midnight. Others turned her line into a rallying cry, flashing images of marchers, historical protests, and faces of activists past and present, bridging her words with the long continuum of struggle. Twitter became a battlefield of memes and one-liners. Screenshots of Alito's raised eyebrow were captioned, "When tradition meets the truth." A gif of Crockett calmly leaning forward, lips pressed into a knowing smile, was shared with the tagline, "This is what composure looks like." And everywhere the phrase itself was repeated like scripture, tweeted, reposted, retweeted, printed onto hastily mocked-up t-shirts that sold out overnight. By evening, the mainstream media had joined the chorus. CNN ran the segment with the headline, "Crockett's Clash, Tradition on Trial." MSNBC commentators replayed the moment on loop, dissecting it as a turning point in the cultural conversation about power and representation. Even outlets not known for their sympathy couldn't resist. Fox News labeled it disrespectful grandstanding. But even in that dismissal, they amplified her words, ensuring their audience heard them too. Celebrities piled on. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "This is why representation matters. Crockett spoke for all of us tonight." John Legend posted a clip with a simple flame emoji. Hassan Minhaj stitched Crockett's mic drop into a comedic monologue on Instagram, calling it the most satisfying political takedown of the year. Even rivals, often cautious with praise, couldn't ignore it. One veteran congresswoman from across the aisle was overheard muttering, "She's got guts." A line quickly leaked and shared across news blogs. YouTube lit up with reaction clips. Political commentators broke down the moment frame by frame, voices rising with excitement as they pointed out Alito's subtle retreat into silence. Progressive creators labeled it a generational clapback. Even neutral channels that normally steered clear of politics jumped in, titling videos, Did Rep. Crockett just make history? The thumbnails were all the same, her eyes locked on Alito, unwavering, unshaken. And it wasn't just digital. On college campuses, student groups began printing posters overnight, her words emblazoned in bold fonts across dorm walls. Murals were sketched on protest banners. Rallies were planned with Crockett's face beside civil rights leaders of the past. She had crossed a threshold few politicians ever reach. She wasn't just a representative anymore. She was a symbol. For those who watched it live, there was a sense of belonging, of being part of something that mattered. People tweeted things like, "I'll never forget where I was when she said that line." Parents showed their children the clip. Young activists, often disillusioned by the monotony of politics, posted about feeling inspired again, about believing, at least for a moment, that words could change the balance of power. Of course, backlash came too. Editorials accused her of being too confrontational. Conservative commentators warned that tradition is under attack. But even their outrage proved the point. The fight had leapt from the marble chamber into living rooms, timelines, and dinner table arguments. Crockett's words had become a mirror, and everyone in America was forced to see themselves reflected in it, whether with pride, fear, or denial. It was more than a viral clip. It was a rupture, a moment where culture and politics collided so forcefully that nothing felt the same afterward. And yet, beyond the noise of the internet, one question lingered. What did this clash really mean for America's future? When the dust settled, when the headlines cooled, and the hashtags began to fade from their fever pitch, one truth remained etched in the air. Jasmine Crockett had done more than spar with a justice. She had forced the nation to confront the meaning of its own identity. Tradition, Alito had argued, was sacred. But Crockett had revealed the flaw hidden in that reverence. Tradition without justice is not strength, it is stagnation. A rulebook written to preserve exclusion, a ceremony meant to silence voices, a hierarchy designed to keep power in the hands of the few, that is not the heartbeat of America. That is the weight that America has spent centuries struggling to shake off. Crockett reframed the confrontation, not as a duel of personalities, but as a defining question. What does America honor? Is it the comfort of old rituals, or the courage to make those rituals serve freedom? Do we worship the marble of the past, or do we carry forward the spirit of those who demanded liberty be more than a promise on parchment? Her words, her presence, her composure made it plain. The real tradition of this country is not silence. It is not obedience. It is not bowing to those who claim authority without accountability. The real tradition of America is the march, the protest, the voices raised in unison for dignity. From Selma to Stonewall, from suffragettes to Dreamers, America's story is written not by those who guarded the gates but by those who dared to push them open. That is why the moment resonated so deeply. It wasn't just about Alito and Crockett. It was about an older America trying to freeze the clock, and a newer America refusing to be bound by it. It was about every immigrant who ever felt dismissed, every woman told she was too much, every working-class child told the room was not meant for them. Crockett carried all of them when she spoke, and in doing so, reminded us of the nation's unfinished promise. She showed that dignity is not found in quiet deference, but in unapologetic truth. That equality is not granted from above, but demanded from below. And that courage, spoken calmly but firmly in the face of power, can move mountains no tradition can hold in place. For the viewers at home, it was not just a scene to watch but a mirror to step into. It was validation that they were not alone in their frustrations, their hopes, their belief that America could be better than its past. And so Crockett's voice rose above the clash, transforming the insult hurled at her into a rallying cry. Tradition is only as worthy as the justice it upholds. That is the moral. That is the legacy. That is the story worth passing down. And that brings us to you, the viewer, because this story doesn't end here. Justice Samuel Alito accused Jasmine Crockett of disrespecting tradition. But what the nation witnessed was not disrespect. It was defiance in the name of dignity. He came armed with the weight of old authority, cloaked in the language of hierarchy. She stood with the fire of lived struggle, calm yet unshakable, and proved that justice, not tradition, is America's true inheritance. This was more than a clash of words. It was the story of a guardian of the past facing a voice of the future. It was arrogance against authenticity, entitlement against empathy, and in the end, it was Crockett's clarity that carried the day. She didn't just answer an insult. She turned it into a mirror, forcing a nation to ask itself who we really are. And now that question comes to you. Will this moment vanish into the cycle of news, or will it become part of the movement that shapes tomorrow? Every share, every replay, every conversation carries her courage further. Every voice that joins in ensures this was not just a viral clip, but a spark in a greater fire for justice and dignity. If you believe in amplifying voices that refuse to be silenced, if you want these untold truths to keep reaching millions, then don't just watch. Be part of it. Subscribe now, share this story, and carry the message forward. Because movements are not built by tradition. They are built by people like you, choosing to stand on the side of justice, of equality, of America's truest values. The story doesn't end here. In fact, it's only just beginning.